Now, one of my favorite shows on television of all time, I've loved it for years, is the Comedy Central hit show South Park. And one of my favorite characters, even though he hasn't been a character in very many episodes that South Park has ever created, is a character called Captain Hindsight. Now, Captain Hindsight looks like a superhero. He even can fly like a superhero, and he shows up at events where you would expect a superhero to show up. However, instead of being a hero, doing heroic things, saving people, Captain Hindsight, as kind of given away in his name, shows up and then lectures people about what they should have done after the fact. Now, you probably can tell by the title or the thumbnail or both of this video that I will be comparing one Kyle Kulinski to Captain Hindsight. But I want to be 100% fair to Kyle, and I want to be 100% condemnation-y, which is not a word, to everyone else. Because in reality, we are all a little bit Captain Hindsight. We all look back on decisions in the past with the knowledge of the future that the person making that decision in the past did not have, and we make judgments based on not the information they had at the time, but what we know now in the future. And this is pretty absurd. We should all be able to remember a time in our own lives where we had to make a decision and it didn't work out. And when we look back and actually put ourselves in the same position we were, knowing what we knew at the time when we made that decision that didn't end up ultimately working out, and acknowledging that in those same circumstances, without the knowledge of the future, we would have likely made the same decision. Because sometimes the correct decision, in hindsight, is something that you could possibly not know back in the past. And even more important, sometimes the correct decision in hindsight seems like the absolute incorrect decision at the time that the decision was made. Now, I'm not just bringing this up in the context of this conversation. I actually think this is something important for everybody to understand in every type of situation, not just the political. Sometimes we're too harsh on ourselves and we're too harsh on others based, again, on knowledge that we or the person we're being too harsh on could not have possibly known. And that's the basic premise of Captain Hindsight. It's not a lot of use to rag on somebody for not knowing something beforehand, especially when there was no possible way of them knowing that at the time. Now, with that being said, at least typically, Captain Hindsight actually points out things that people could have done or should have done prior to whatever crisis they found themselves in. Kyle Kulinski is completely wrong with all of the hindsight and completely stupid with all of the hindsight, and normally this wouldn't be an issue, but it becomes an issue when almost every single regressive, idiot, communist, socialist, whatever they want to call themselves on the internet, parrots this guy's talking points. So when I watch a video like this about how the pandemic and capitalism are best friends, even though Kyle Kulinski is watching an interview from Richard Wolff, a Marxist economist, I know that's an oxymoron, and Kyle Kulinski claims that he's not a socialist, he's actually a social democrat, there's some problems beyond what we're talking about today, but we can't get into those. So, without further ado, let's go into the video and why the pandemic and Richard Wolff have put forward a damning indictment of capitalism. Don't you feel damned, you capitalist scumbag? Don't you feel indicted? I don't, because I'm not as stupid as the people who follow Kyle Kulinski.
Professor Richard Wolff spoke to David Pakman, and he gave us a scathing indictment of how the U.S. handled COVID.
Why in the world were we unprepared? We had companies that can produce masks and gloves and ventilators and all of that, but they didn't do it. And I know why. I'm an economist. What I study, it isn't profitable. No company wants to produce masks by the millions, store them in warehouses around the country where the population is concentrated, make sure that they are clean, make sure that they don't deteriorate, replace those that do, watch the whole thing. And then you never know when the next virus will be. Will you have to sit on all of this for 2 years, for 6 years, or for 20 years? So it's not profitable. It's not a rational, capitalist, profit-driven calculation to make. So the companies didn't, and we didn't have the ventilators, the gloves, the masks, and all the rest.
Now, there's a ton of dumb, inaccurate, and Captain Hindsighting going on by Richard Wolff. First and foremost, what Richard Wolff is saying is just factually not true. The idea that companies weren't stockpiling N95 masks is completely false. Do you guys not remember all of the tech companies that were in fact stockpiling N95 masks that they ended up churning over to the medical community in order to serve the needs of the American people during this crisis? Now, the reason they were stockpiling that was not for a pandemic that comes once every 100 years. The reason they were stockpiling that was because they're based in California and a lot of their workers didn't feel comfortable coming to work without some kind of facial protection during fire season. So there were in fact people stockpiling these things. By the way, the shortage of PPE is not unique to the United States of America. A lot of people got their PPE produced by the Chinese Communist government, and because the Chinese were determined to lie to the world, they actually withheld all outgoing shipments, and that's what left people with their pants down at the beginning of this. However, the idea that we should have just been stockpiling all this material is a little bit ridiculous, again, because it's a once-in-a-100-year kind of event. Number 2, Richard Wolff mentions ventilators, which is stupid for 3 different reasons. Number 1, the federal government has not been replenishing its own stockpile of ventilators, despite the fact that there are a number of notices that have gone out about the stockpile needing to be replenished. Now, to be fair to the federal government, what I'm doing right now is using hindsight, the knowledge of the future that people could not have known back then, in order to criticize them. Because honestly, this goes into my second point, we did not know whether or not we were going to need ventilators in the future. That was going to be the desperately needed thing for the pandemic. Let's say we had all the ventilators that we could have possibly ever imagined stockpiled across the country for a respiratory-related pandemic, and all of a sudden the pandemic came out, and it turns out we needed a bunch of dialysis machines because the thing that the pandemic actually targeted was the kidneys. Now let's say, oh, well, we should have all the ventilators and all the dialysis machines, and then it turns out we need something else completely different. The fact of the matter is, no person, country, nation, or whatever is ever going to be prepared enough for a situation like this. All you can do is have the potential productive capacity to produce these things in a pinch in order to meet that demand. Which leads us to the third thing that Richard Wolff is being completely stupid about. Because at one point, this guy had the audacity to compare the United States to Italy.
The European countries, it wasn't done. Unemployment in Italy during the entire COVID period was less than it was a year before that when there was no COVID.
Pop quiz for those of you with a memory longer than a couple of months. Which country between the United States and Italy was actually churning away patients, depending on if they were 65 and then moved down to the age of 60, from ventilators because they had a shortage? Was it the United States of America, or was it Italy? Surprise, it was Italy. So the audacity for him to say Italy takes care of its population when they were short on the very thing that the United States produced so much of in a pinch, we're actually sending them around the world, is absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, I have a little bit of a bonus, because remember when I mentioned the theoretical pandemic, the one that affects the kidneys, that makes ventilators pretty much useless? Well, it turns out we don't really have to go to a theoretical pandemic, because the United States probably overproduced ventilators, because it turns out the issue with the virus that we're currently dealing with now may not be an issue of your lungs literally not being able to breathe, but in fact an issue of oxygen not being able to get into your red blood cells. This is why at a number of hospitals in my area, and yes, I know this is anecdotal, and yes, I know I'm not a scientist, so please, grain of salt right here, but it is important to get this out there. They are actually using bypass machines to oxygenate the blood for people, because once you're on the ventilator, that's kind of like a last resort and you're pretty much done. The point I'm trying to make is there's no way of knowing beforehand what you'll actually need, and even in the middle of this, we don't know what's actually effective and what's complete and total waste. Which is why Richard Wolff is an idiot, and Kyle Kulinski regurgitating this and thinking this is profound shows that he's not very bright either.
German unemployment went from 5% roughly in March to 6% roughly now. In short, in every major European country, they did not do what the United States did. They didn't throw tens of millions of people out of work, throwing them on unemployment. So here was the deal in Europe. The government will help you in your business, but you cannot fire anyone.
This I love almost more than anything, because in reality, the United States unemployment rate is so high, not because of our restrictions, not because we did something fundamentally different and more greedy than the European nations, but it's actually high because we decided to pay out the benefits to people during these hard times through the unemployment system. We actually incentivized people to go on unemployment with a $600 bonus. And I remember specifically Kyle Kulinski supporting Bernie Sanders when he was wrong to challenge Lindsey Graham on this point that they were actually giving away way too much money, so much so that they were incentivizing more people to go on unemployment. And again, this isn't just speculation. This isn't just something that Lindsey Graham and Republicans and conservatives knew before that. Looking back, we know for a fact that this definitely happened. In order to be incredibly generous to the American people, we passed the largest stimulus bill in the history of the world. And in that stimulus bill, we had countervailing objectives. We basically told businesses that if they took out loans to keep their business afloat, that they couldn't lay off anybody. But at the same time, we incentivized people who actually worked at those businesses to want to get laid off because they could make way more money on unemployment than a lot of them could make at their businesses actually working. So we created this situation, and we have inflated unemployment numbers compared to other nations that did not handle it through their unemployment system. And now we're looking at what is clearly an artificial inflation or an artificial suppression in unemployment in European nations, and calling Americans stupid and saying that we bungled the economy in this situation. Now, we might have very well done that with the lockdowns and the restrictions. There's a lot of data from economists right now, and actually scientists right now, saying that the lockdowns are a mistake. But the bill, in spirit, is basically identical to what a lot of European nations and other Western nations did. But our unemployment is inflated because, again, we paid people through the unemployment system when other nations just did not do that.
And the reason why we didn't have warehouses with N95 masks and ventilators and everything we would need for such a situation is because it wasn't profitable to do that.
This is an intellectual leader on the internet left. The reason we didn't have everything we needed for this once-in-a-100-year crisis is because it wasn't profitable to do that. That's Kyle Kulinski. That's him. That's how you sound, Kyle Kulinski, if somebody sends you this video. The reason we didn't have that is because it makes no sense to stockpile literally everything on the off chance that we have the one thing for the one crisis that occurs once every 100 years. The reason we didn't have 1 billion ventilators in warehouses across the country is the same reason that I don't have a lava trench dug around my apartment in New York City. While there is a chance that a volcano could erupt and lava could be flowing through the streets, it's super rare, and there's no real way to predict that, and it would cost way too much money for me to maintain a lava trench around my apartment in New York City on the off chance that a volcano would erupt. In Hawaii, the calculation a little bit more different, because a volcano eruption, a little bit more likely over there. But again, not the most likely source of tragedy. There's a reason that people in earthquake zones have more earthquake proofing than places that don't have a lot of earthquake zones. The reason a lot of Asia had pandemic prep all ready to go is because they've been hit time and time again in recent history with Asian pandemics or Chinese specific pandemics. We have not experienced that as much. Therefore, we didn't have all the things. Also, sometimes you can't just stockpile all of the things for all of the potential organs and things that could actually hurt people. And sometimes, even in the middle of a pandemic, just like I mentioned with the ventilators, building up a stockpile because you think you might need something turns out to be a giant waste of money. But go ahead, Kyle. Explain it to me that some socialists, some more progressive nation would have had everything, even though nobody had everything, and the United States is sending ventilators around the world. Please explain it, Kyle. Go. No, go. Like, this is where the clip comes in.
And under our system, what's the point if it's not profitable to do it? If it's not profitable to do it, and there's no short-term benefit to anybody, to a moneyed interest out there, what's the point?
You know, for somebody who is self-proclaimed to be super skeptical of the military-industrial complex, for Kyle Kulinski to claim that there's no moneyed interest in stockpiling unnecessary or usually unnecessary stuff is absolutely crazy. In fact, one of the reasons why the federal supply of ventilators was taking so long to be repaired and built is because it was on a government contract and they were dragging that out. But more importantly, again, this is all hindsight looking back, and what might not even prove to be accurate hindsight looking back, because the ventilators weren't as needed or as useful as we originally thought at the beginning when we ramped up production. By the way, the moneyed interest in the ventilator building is still what's pushing the ramped up production that goes on today. Even if ventilators are completely useless and hospitals aren't asking for them, and even when the pandemic is put totally in the rearview mirror in the history of this country, the moneyed interest will be having the federal government dole out money to them to make useless ventilators. Again, more important than all of that is the hindsight of the future that Kyle is trying to put back on the past, and the fact that he's saying that non-capitalist countries wouldn't have this problem, when again, every country in the world had this problem, but the United States was able to build up their supply so fast that literally no person was turned down on ventilators.
We were caught. And we had no idea how to handle this. We were scrambling from day one. He said it. We have, about 4% of the population of the world and 25% of the COVID deaths. Even if you account for other countries fudging their numbers, we still have a disproportionate, number. And a lot of that is because of how we're handling it. And
all right, let's take on this talking point. The United States of America is the third most populated country in the world in terms of our population. In terms of developing countries, we are number one, which means that we are more likely to have the most accurate counts of who's actually sick or who's actually getting ill from it. So you can compare us to other modern developed countries. And even in that, the United States is middle of the pack. We're not doing that well. Our death rate is pretty high. A lot of people are being infected by it. But in reality, we're not going to know the full extent and who messed up and who did the right thing until years from now, when we can actually look back on this and do an analysis, because we're seeing spikes in Europe right now. We're seeing a downward trend, the curve flattening in most of the United States. So we don't know by the end of this thing how every nation is going to do at this time. Remember, Italy was thought to be the absolute worst, but it seems like they got hit so hard that they're the one of the few countries in Europe that's not experiencing a large second wave. We also don't know about the potential for some kind of background resistance or immunity that's in the population. As I pointed out before, a lot of Asian nations or nations around China have a better response system, but that doesn't mean that necessarily that response system is what's helping them deal with this. It could be that different strains of this type of illness that didn't cause symptoms or any real alarm were just mixed in those populations and they had some immunity. Again, I'm not a scientist. Let me just pause and make this clear. Time out. This is just me speculating based on the very rudimentary knowledge that I know about scientific theories. But I find it really interesting that in Japan they didn't close karaoke bars and they didn't close other indoor things, and they're nowhere near as bad as us. And their president or prime minister, whatever they have in Japan, who the hell cares, was being criticized heavily for a lackadaisical response, and yet his numbers aren't that bad, again, compared to ours and Europe, which are just further away from the origin point. Now, there might be something to that. We don't know how this is all going to shake out when this is all over. We don't know if there's a lot of fudging in the numbers in nations like China, or a lack of development that's not getting the appropriate numbers from a nation like Italy. We just don't know now because, again, we are in the middle of it. But it looks very convenient if you're somebody like Kyle Kulinski, and this confirms your priors, to point to the numbers right now at this point in history and act like they prove something, even though over time, logically, it will not prove out to be true. We're going to have differences in where all the nations rank by the time that this thing is over. That's obvious. The United States is either going to be better or worse. Place your bets now, but we just don't know now. And basing it on the numbers now is, again, just assuming this random data point is the only crucial data point and basing all your positions on it.
Again, you could see it even in economic reaction too, how irresponsible we are. You have Canada has a pretty generous benefits package that's still paying out. Here we did a one-time 1,200, I think, stimulus check.
I have to be perfectly honest. I have no real idea why Kyle Kulinski is considered this intellectual, this thought leader on the online left. I can speculate that it's probably because the people that regurgitate Kyle's talking points almost word for word are not that politically savvy themselves, but I don't know. Maybe it's because he talks in that weird voice where he's like, oh, well, maybe this or that. But in reality, he's not saying anything more substantive than random crap that dumb people post on your own social media. Canada's benefits package is not in any way, shape, or form more generous than the United States of America. And this idea that Canada was giving people $2,000 a month and the United States only gave a one-time payment of $1,200 is complete and utter nonsense. First of all, Canada's $2,000 is $2,000 Canadian, which translates to about $1,400 a month. The United States added $600 on top of whatever your state unemployment benefit was a week, meaning that the average American on unemployment, which by the way, you only get the Canadian benefit if you're unemployed, was receiving $2,400, a full $2,000 more USD than Canada from just the added federal benefit to unemployment. That's not even factoring in what you can get on unemployment normally. Here in New York, you can get $510 on unemployment. So if you got the full $510 plus the $600, that's $1,100 every week on unemployment, $4,400 a month. But Canada is the more generous nation than the United States of America.
And we shut down so much, so people were losing their jobs and they weren't getting help. They only got that one stimulus check, and then they're screwed.
This point that the Canadians were so generous when all our government did was just give you $1,200 is as stupid, irrelevant, and inaccurate coming out of Kyle Kulinski's mouth as it is when your aunt posted it on Instagram with the hashtag #OrangeManBad. You're completely wrong here, and it's embarrassing that somebody who's revered as this intellectual on the left can't even accurately report what Canada did versus the United States of America. Again, we passed the largest stimulus bill. Well, I didn't pass it, but Congress passed the largest stimulus bill in the history of the world for the United States pandemic response. And that's not generous enough. By the way, Kyle's talking about things, or Richard Wolff was talking about things where they paid the employers to make sure the employees weren't unemployed. Kyle called that corporate welfare, and he said that that part of the bill was bad. So even the very thing that he's advocating for, the incentives that were set up in Europe so people wouldn't get laid off, Kyle was against at the time. So the results should be on people like him who thought giving the companies money to make sure that they can maintain their payroll was corporate welfare.
The CARES Act was really more to help corporate America and the billionaires, and the Fed's actions were more to help the stock market.
The $1,200 one-time payment was for people who filed tax returns within the last 3 years and made under $99,000 a year. If you were unemployed, once again, you got $600 a week extra from the federal government on top of your state benefits, which amounts on its own to double the Canadian system, which Kyle described as incredibly generous. At what point does this level of ignorance turn into an obvious sign that Kyle Kulinski is either lying or the ignorance is disqualification on its own? This guy sells himself as a policy wonk, but he's either lying or just doesn't know anything about policy. Again, an intellectual leader for the internet left.
So the people who got left behind were the workers. There was no payment plan where we nationalize wages, where we get 80% or whatever of your wages if you're a worker. We didn't have that. We didn't have a universal basic income program. We don't even have Medicare for all. So people go bankrupt because of medical bills in a pandemic. In a pandemic.
Again, we already offered, through expanded unemployment benefits, more money than a lot of people were making at their actual job. I remember when people pointed out that this would cause unemployment, and Kyle Kulinski and Bernie Sanders said that they just hated poor people. Turns out Kyle was wrong, and the people who warned about that were in fact 100% right. What Kyle considers a generous benefit by the Canadian government has been far outdone by the United States government, to the tune of more than double in just enhanced federal support, not counting what you get at your normal state level for unemployment. So I don't know what Kyle's talking about there, that we're not being generous enough, unless he thinks Canada's system is automatically not generous anymore because he didn't know anything about it when he just started spouting off at the mouth. Also, people's healthcare when it comes to the virus is covered. I know we saw a lot of big stories about how people were getting giant bills, but in reality, if you actually read the stories past the headline, you would find that that is the bill of costs, but that cost is being covered by the federal government or by the insurance company, which honestly will be bailed out by the federal government. Even though I can't stand that, is covered, and that should be something that Kyle mentions, but of course he doesn't, because the policy wonk can't be bothered with the nitty-gritty details of policy, because he has an entire left-wing army of spurgs to inspire to repeat and vomit up his same talking points. So in conclusion, Kyle is wrong about everything, and so is Richard Wolff. The countries that he compared us to in terms of ventilators, a lot of them are getting their ventilators from the United States of America. Also, stockpiling ventilators turns out might have been a complete and total waste of time, just like the increased production of ventilators, because, again, we're using different things, like President Trump was put on supplemental oxygen, and a lot of doctors have been moving away from the ventilators because they find them ineffective. In terms of PPE, the same shortages that faced the United States of America faced Europe, but again, the United States produced a lot of PPE really quickly. We got a lot of the masks that we needed from the tech companies that just happened to be stockpiling them because it actually was profitable, because it actually made their workers show up to work, proving them wrong again. And their hindsight, while amazing and fun as it is to say, well, looking back, I would have made this decision, turned out to be just about as accurate as all the predictions, aka Kyle Kulinski's foresight. Which means total fail. Like, completely failed. Kyle and Richard Wolff. Also, this clip was from the David Pakman show. He probably failed too, but I didn't even bother to watch this video because whatever, who cares? Those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Unless you disagree with me, then keep that to yourself. Just keep that in your heart, because I don't care. Like this video if you like it, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social media, they are linked in the description of this video, it's amazing. Support me via the support links, although YouTube join is the worst of all the support links. Go to Patreon, subscribe, Venmo, PayPal, way better. Till next time. Kyle sucks.